you, Kathleen. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to warn you, there's a thunderstorm here in Mexico City. So if you hear thunders, don't be scared. It's really amazing to be here. I'm so privileged to be surrounded by investors and entrepreneurs in a sector that has so much potential in Latin America and has can have the potential of doing so much good. So we're going to have first a conversation around what's impacting the sector, what trends our guests are seeing, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So the idea in this conversation is to cover the perspective of from entrepreneurs and investors, talking about that perspective in general. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with introducing myself, and then I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves. So I'm Federico Antoni. I'm a venture capital investor that invests in Latin America. I'm also a lecturer at the Stanford GSB. And then I'm an MBA 2004. I'm from Mexico and based in Mexico, but invest all across the region. So Carlos, why don't you start?
Carlos, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Done. Okay, sorry guys. Direct from Brazil, GSB 2004, working with higher education for 20 years. Since 2000, I was running a larger group of universities in Brazil, 115,000 students, and also a board member at Eleva till last year. Very happy to be here back in the GSB.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you. My name is Daniel Uribe. I am from Barranquilla, Colombia. I'm an MBA Master in Education joint degree, graduating in June. And I've been an education entrepreneur the last 4 years in the for-profit and non-profit sector back in Colombia. And I'm joining an education investment fund and venture builder called Appin Education Ventures, focused on Latin America as soon as I graduate. Happy to be here.
Iona.
Hi, everybody. My name is Iona. I'm also Brazilian. I graduated from Stanford Graduate School of Education in 2014 in Policy, Organization, and Leadership Studies. And since then, I'm here in the Valley in Menlo Park, close by the farm, working in ed tech companies, basically B2B SaaS companies. And also I taught 2 years here in the local district of Menlo Park. Now I am the founder and CEO of Education Journey, a startup that wants to advance more innovation in education by curating and bringing together edtech solutions as a corporate benefit. Very happy to be here and excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Martin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Martin Ferraro. I'm MBA from class 2011. I'm based in Lima, Peru, where I run the venture fund for the Hochschild family office. The group invests in basically the mining, cement, and education sector, but our investment thesis from the fund is mainly centered around the future of education. So I'm very happy to share some thoughts and idea with all of you today. Thanks for the invitation.
And finally, Jimena.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jimena. I'm an MBA too. I'm graduating this year with Daniel, and I come from Peru. Before coming to Stanford, I worked in perfectly, as this panel is called, in the intersection between education and investments. I worked in private equity in Peru, specializing in our education portfolio. And basically what we're trying to do is bridging this gap between access to education and quality education for the growing middle class in Latin America.
Great. Thank you all. Let's start. So let's start with the biggest topic of our time, the impact of the pandemic in the economy and in our lives. Has been very strong and has been on the education sector, of course. What surprised you in the way that, or even the public sector? What was surprising about how these stakeholders have reacted to the pandemic? Let's start with you, Jimena.
Okay, Federico, you broke off a little bit. So just to rephrase, we're talking about the impact of the pandemic and what surprised us for how the industry reacted, basically, and the different stakeholders. For me, I think one of the things that jumped off the most was like the ease of adaptation of like all the players in the industry. If you had asked me like 2 or 3 years ago whether like basically every single agent of society would be able to switch online for education, I would have said no. Thinking about like my teachers from when I was like in high school, just thinking about them like sending emails and working through Zoom, it would have been incredibly and like insane. And I was very surprised and pleased to see how the pandemic hit at different points of the academic year, depending on where, in which hemisphere you were. In Peru, we were like about to start the academic year. In Mexico, we were like more towards the end. And it was so quickly that we were able to adapt and switch fully to an online offering almost seamlessly. And how quickly like also parents adapt and we're like, okay, this is our reality now. And my kids have to go to school and this is the way we're gonna do it. And also we saw a lot of like how fast some trends were accelerated during this time. So we're also seeing a lot of like people using a lot of technological tools for learning, especially in K to 12 that used to be only reserved for like higher levels of education. And on the other hand, I think this also like exacerbated and showed a lot how important the school, like the physical space of the school was. Because even though online education has worked and continues to work, we also see how parents and children and teachers are missing like the in-person aspects, like the psychological safety of having like your group in your school and in your environment. So I think both elements are kind of showing like a trend towards like a more hybrid reality post-pandemic that I think would be very interesting to explore.
Fascinating. Thank you, Jimena. What about Brazil, Carlos? I'm sure you have seen things that have surprised you.
I think in Brazil is happening. We are seeing what we are seeing everywhere in the world. You know, it's impressive. I'll talk about my kids, but even better, right? My daughter wakes up. She's 8, log in Zoom, do her classes, raises her hand to speak, put her microphone on mute, send her homework, right? So this is something that they didn't know how to do a year ago, right? And I think what's going to happen when things go back to normal, right? We are going to just, throw their notebooks away. And, so I think the transformation is incredible, was a need. There was a lot of inertia in the sector, right? I think that the 10 years ago when I was working in higher education, people were saying every time, right? 5 years from now, the world will be destroyed by technology. And then 5 years later, 5 years from now, the world will be destroyed by technology. And it never happens, right? Because it's very comfortable to stay in the same model. Right now, we were forced to change. And I think this trend, I think what's beautiful is to see this trend staying, right? Because online is better for certain things than on-site. So I think on-site will be back for many of the experiences that the kids need, and even in higher education. But online allows us to do things that you couldn't do before, and that part will come and stay. And that's fascinating to watch, And
What do you think about that's a great example, Carlos. What do you think about that, Iona?
I was hoping you wouldn't call me to comment on that, because I actually am going to bring a total different perspective on what surprised me the most. But thinking outside of our world, in our environment, thinking about the public sector and how massive Brazil is, 90s, although 96% of the states in Brazil have implemented some sort of online learning platform and online learning solutions. Only 45% of the states are providing free data access to the students. For example, 40% of the public school students in Brazil don't have access to tablets, and 58% of the Brazil's total population access internet only through their mobile devices. So how rapidly we had to adjust to the pandemic have still a mismatch in how the public sector has adapted and how the Brazilian population, students even more, are able to adapt to that. So again, 70% of the teachers have reported some sort of trouble dealing with the online solutions that now they have to deal with because it was maybe too fast. I think that what surprised me the most is how unprepared the public sector and some of us were to deal with all this fast changing pace. And I think that we are in a good track. I'm an optimistic, but I think that we are still in need to acknowledge all the work we need to do to be aligned with the changes that we are implemented and then we are needing to face, because I think that the world is not going to go back, Degas. So, and it's good, right? I mean, we should take good out of this crisis because this crisis is charging us so much. So the good side is that we'll not go back to delay the use and the adoption and the best that technology can bring to us.
That's a very interesting perspective, and it is preoccupying indeed about this mismatch between how some have adapted and others haven't been able to adapt.
I don't know if Frederico is having some connection problems. I could go on talking, but I'm going to be respectful.
Am I back? Am I back?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Yes,
Sorry
yes,
about
you
that.
are.
I was going to ask, I was asking Daniel, and I'm going to switch while Daniel speak. How can you put together everything between the good and the bad that Degas described and that Iona also described? And is there anything that the Colombian perspective would bring to help us understand that?
I would summarize it as empathy between the different challenges that each stakeholder in the sector is having. Empathy with what the teachers are going through, which is something new and basically having to adapt to this new reality. Empathy on what the parents have to do, which is like doing their day-to-day jobs and then helping the students do homework and do childcare. Empathy also for what the government officials are doing and the challenges that are happening. Just to give you the example of Colombia, on one end you have, parents and teachers wanting to, parents mostly wanting for the students to go to school and for the students to continue learning. But on the other hand, you have the teacher unions who are basically saying that they don't want to allow their teachers to go to class because they can get infected and having having health issues because of COVID. Also, government officials dealing with these two two fronts. And it's unfortunate also like how it becomes so political, because at the end with the polarized society that we have, you go to the two extremes, and at the end the ones that end up suffering from all this are the students. And actually, if there's a great study done by UNESCO, it's called Education on Hold, which I highly suggest all of you to Google it. It's basically the impact of COVID on Latin America's childhood and education sector. It has some amazing facts, but like just a couple, just around the region could see a loss of around $1.2 trillion during the life cycle of this cohort of students that are being affected. That's massive. And just to acknowledge that this is a tragedy, what's happening in the sector, and just trying to have empathy for all sides and trying to collaborate together, I think is the way forward.
I think that's very important what you're mentioning, Daniel, and it's definitely something that we have to keep in mind. But surely, what Carlos was mentioning about how this has accelerated technology adoption, and maybe there were two step backs, and maybe we can come back with a vengeance, leveraging technology. What do you think about that, Martin?
Well, I think that if we see what already happened in other industries, such as banking, retail, and whatnot, I do see a clear trend on what's going to happen in education. And of course, this is a trend that we're going to start seeing some activity going on in developed economies, and probably we're going to see the impact in Latin America a little bit later. But just by checking few reports, and I recommend Whole Loan IQ. I'll put it on the chat later as a great source of information. They estimate that between 2019 and 2020, we probably have seen a rise of 30 to 40% on the funding that ed tech companies have received year over year. So, and even in countries such as Peru, back in 2019, we probably had meetings with ed tech entrepreneurs on a monthly basis. And now it is not, I mean, it isn't surprising that on a month you will probably have weekly meetings with people trying to get into the sector. So definitely what we're seeing is that education is gonna get a different pace in terms of innovation and funding. And we should expect very, very interesting things going on in the space. And one very interesting thing in my mind is that for institutions, for schools and elementary schools, they were forced to do this. They had to change. But we always saw teachers as blockers of innovation, and probably they were going to be the last to adopt changes. And I'm seeing a very positive change in the way they react to some of the new tools that are out there. I hope so, Federico. But it's interesting. It's interesting. Like the group owns a large engineering school. I've been very, very pleased and surprised to see how effective they've been in trying to switch the model from fully face-to-face to a hybrid model. So I have high expectation on what technology can do in this industry.
Interesting. And I'm going to ask Carlos, what do you think about Martin's hopeful message around teachers? Are teachers going to help rather than block this time?
I think I agree with Martin. I think resistance is over. For many years, there was inertia in the system, right? The model was better for the schools. You don't have to work, you make profit if you're for profit, right? You don't have to do work. Teachers, I'm used to this class, I'll do it again because no work for me. And students, oh, it's so good. I sit down here and watch the class, So there was inertia. The three stakeholders in the system were happy with it. I think now the barrier was broken, and I think that's amazing. That's what I was trying to say before. I think that's just amazing, fantastic. And I don't think we're going to go back.
What do you think, Yona? Are they going to go back?
No, definitely not. Thank God. No, and again, I think that this is something we should really take from all this crisis, how we saw many years of in a few months. I think that teachers are definitely understanding that the fastest and the more effective they adapt, the better, end result they will have, which means like students enjoying more and more engaged in the platform, better results, even a more fun way of teaching. I think also there's a big change that I'm very happy to see. Either new products or new companies that they are much more teacher friendly, engaging, and fun than what we saw before the pandemic. We now know, for example, we are using Zoom, right? Lots of schools are using Zoom, but Zoom was not built for education. This is a big adaptation that we are seeing. So what I am happy now to see is that teachers are more collaborating more with product development, because they are understanding that this is something that they will directly benefit from. And we are seeing a new generation of products and services in education that it's much more effective to the end user and to the so
That's a great point, and we have a great comment from Kim on the chat that also offers us a little bit of the limits of online education, in particular for younger children. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Moving on, it seems that some of the old debates of the industry have or are going to outlive the pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about some trade-offs. The typical trade-off between quality and access, for-profit, non-for-profit. Do you think that debates are going to change in their nature of the debates, or are we still going to discuss that after the pandemic ends? Daniel, why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. So I think what this brings is also like collaboration between, for example, for-profit and non-profit. And just to give and it all in the sector, because of how regulated the sector is, it all depends on, pre-K, K-12, higher ed. They're all very different. But just to give an example, in Colombia, for example, K-12 can be for-profit and non-profit. And there's public sector schools, and then there's private sector schools can be for-profit or non-profit. And at the end, they're all, they are all providing different, like there's great access in K-12 education in Colombia. Basically, every kid that wants to go to school could potentially go to school for a free school if they want to go in the public way, but the quality is not the best. But then you have the other trade-off where maybe you see some institutions that have great quality, but maybe the price is too much. So there's still this part. But then, for example, in the higher education sector, where you see that it's very different, because it's all of the higher education institutions, there's public and private, but within private, they all have to be non-profit. It's by law. But then you see COVID, and then everyone has to go remote, everyone has to go to online learning, and a lot of these institutions don't have the technical and technological capabilities to go online. And that's where, like, how can there be a collaboration between maybe for-profit startups and institutions on the outside that could provide these capabilities to this traditional non-profit institutions that have great brands, that have that have their students there, but maybe they don't know how to go to this new world, which is online. There's opportunities there on this collaboration. So I think that we have to maybe step back and see as what's best for the student at the end. There's quality and there's access, and then think not be so biased in if it's for profit or non-profit, and just making sure that the results are there, that there's good measurement of the impact of learning on learning outcomes of the students, and then see what's the best way to get there. Sometimes it's through public-private sector collaborations. Other times there's in the private sector, there's non-profit and for-profit, but just making sure that we understand what each sector needs and which are the best vehicles to make sure that the students get access to the proper learnings for their development.
So more collaboration and perhaps less biases, which I think would be very nice. Carlos, I know you have a lot to say about quality. What's your view on that?
Man, I have to be careful to be concise, because that's a thing that I think. Look, I'm a big believer of for-profit education. I think everybody here would prefer flying a for-profit airline that our airline does not make profits on non-profit, right? So in every sector, there's a correlation between quality and profits, right? In education, that was my belief. In Brazil, I don't know if everybody's aware, We have one of the biggest for-profit markets in the world. In higher education, more than 80% of enrollments are private, more than 50% are in for-profit institutions. And K-12 is growing quickly, the for-profit adoption. The for-profit in K-12 is working well. I think in higher education is a pity. It went too far. The problem is in education that the cycles are very long, you know? So you know that your university worked maybe 5 years after someone graduates, because that person will have a good job, is gonna grow in his career or her career, and that's what will happen. So the cycles are so long, then the attitudes you take today, you may have a hard time measuring them. Even regulation sometimes does not capture the thing. So what happens is that in Brazil, it became so consolidated, the higher education market, and everybody migrated to access, right? We want to do tuition as cheap as possible. So you can get your business bachelor degree in Brazil right now online for $10 a month. That's what I'm saying, $10 a month, right? And what's happening is that groups, even which something against my belief, if you have groups with fragmented capital, right, pursuing efficiency and access to extreme, I don't think there are, and look, I'm not generalizing, there are exceptions, but we are having trouble with quality in higher education in Brazil in general, right? As a result, in K-12, we're still good. We have among the top, you get the top 5 K-12 in Brazil. You have nonprofit and for-profit schools together. But I have a fear that this could happen again. K-12, the difference that it's harder to consolidate. Pieces are smaller. In higher education, right, pieces are larger, much easier to consolidate. So that's my frustration and perspective on this.
And the opportunity, of course. Jimena, what's your view on Spanish-speaking Latin America in regard to that phenomenon that Carlos was describing?
Yes, it's really. Oh, sorry. Here next. There. It's really funny for me to hear like Carlos say how like K-12 is still good, but might go too far like higher ed, because I feel like in Spanish-speaking LATAM, we look at Brazil as the example of where we could be. And just for a bit of context, the problem with at least K-12 in Spanish-speaking LATAM is not that much of like access itself, because we do have like public education as a right, but the problem is like access to quality education. So that sort of like creates a gap between like this really lower quality public sector and then this really fragmented private sector, which has on one end like super top quality international standards education at like a super high price tag, and then this whole middle that it's basically bad quality with a price. So you have like this growing middle class that either can go to like the public sector where they're not gonna get like the skills they need to get more opportunities in life, or go into this like for-profit alternatives, which you get a bit of everything. You could get like really good quality or really bad quality. So I think here is like really like the opportunity, and like putting the investor hat for like a moment, here's like the opportunity for like the private sector to invest and actually target this growing middle class and offering something that offers both like access to quality, but a price tag that this class can maintain. And if you achieve that and you actually change that, you get to move the whole region forward, because you're getting graduates with actual skills that would move them forward to higher education and able to gain the skills they'll need forward in life.
That makes a lot of sense. And it seems that the private sector and investment by the private sector can solve many of the problems, but you still need the government to at least get out of the way and cooperate. So it's interesting if we can discuss for a couple of minutes the role of the government and the public policy as we get out of this crisis. I know, Martin, you have an amazing example about public policy in Peru. Why don't you tell us what that example and maybe what's the role of the government, or how you see the government performing to help the private sector solve problems in education?
Sure thing. Thanks, Federico. So in countries such as ours, where less than 10% of the population above 24 have a bachelor degree, you definitely need the help from government in trying to get more people to get a bachelor degree, especially when you know that the salary they can make is twice as much when you don't have a degree. So I would expect them. You said, I mean, they have to get out of the way, but I think they could be clear enablers of what's going to happen. For example, it has, until the pandemic hit, in Peru, you couldn't get a higher education degree online. It was forbidden. It was banned. You couldn't do that, and it was after the pandemic, and actually the law was just passed a few months ago, that now universities could request for a permit so they could offer bachelor degrees in a hybrid or an online format. What is very interesting is that, 10% of the student body in the country just had to drop out in the second semester of 2020. So we have a lot of students that couldn't either afford going to school in that situation, or they didn't have the infrastructure, namely a computer or internet connection, to actually go to the hybrid model that schools improvised. But now that government is actively trying to pass laws and change regulation, I think that a lot of the schools and the whole system is going to adapt to that and offer new programs, such as the ones we were mentioning a little bit earlier. And we always saw Brazil as an example. So it's going to be interesting to see how we learn a lot from that particular experience and make sure that the quality of the programs that both the public and the private schools are going to launch are up to the standards that the students are hoping for.
That's a great example, and it's great to hear that a country that has had so strong lockdowns is actually making it easier for students to study and get diplomas. Iona, what's your view in Brazil in terms of the role of the government? What do you think they should do? What are they doing? Is there something that interesting you're seeing?
I love how you come to questions to me that it's like the only thing that I can say that it's not exactly from an optimistic point of view. But okay, so I think that Brazil's public policy in education specifically lacks stronger and more thoughtful leadership. And we can see, all the countries that inspires us in education from a massive change like Singapore and Poland and Estonia and even Finland, how it really takes the whole country to get education as its core value and build policies around it so that it can have a generational change and have a massive jump in the quality of public education. I think that this is not happening yet in Brazil, unfortunately. The public sector, though, has, of course, a very powerful position to foster, in my view, something that could be the change that we need, which is to foster more entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation from a structural point of view. Right? We can do this from the private sector investments, VCs and private equity. We can have this very fast and very effective with the private capital investing in more solutions. But I think that aligned with the public policy and having the public policy really buying in what a less bureaucratic, more programs and more entrepreneurial-oriented ventures and programs and community building can make to the change of the whole country. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even if I surprise you with my questions, your answers are always great, Iona. So here's a question to either Daniel, Carlos, Jimena. What would make your investment increase in the short term, is there anything the government can do to make you double down on some of your investments? Who wants to take this one? I'm trying to see if anyone unmutes. Jimena, why don't you help me out?
Sure. I'm taking the K to 12 perspective right now. I think that it's always been an attractive market if you think about like the huge opportunity we have, but we also have like a lot of roadblocks, especially with like the Peruvian and the Mexican government, where like in my experience, they can like block you in terms of like what you can do with your program once you have it. For example, in Mexico, if you want to like innovate with your problem, you still have to adjust to like all the rules and like the curriculum, even the books that the government imposes. So if there was like a little bit of freedom there, so like I can take my program and be as innovative as I want to be, that would make me want to double down my investment. Because I think like opening up the room and flexibility to actually make like a different offering and changing traditional education is like where the upside is actually going to be. So just like a bit of like the push and like the help with innovation and flexibility will get me to like get the cash there.
Federico,
Yes.
so I've been speaking about Brazil, but Brazil has the model has many benefits and many things that serve it as an example. I think what we face is poor execution of many of the things, right? One of the programs that were very successful in Brazil is a program called ProUni for universities, because public universities, they're very hard to get in, right? So at the end, you have universities for free for people that could pay very high tuition in K-12, right? And the government created a program that exchange federal taxes for free scholarships. So the cost of these seats in private universities is 1/5 of the cost of a seat in a federal university. So there are good initiatives that you can do. You know, you have to control the adoption and implementation of those initiatives, but we have several initiatives that were really successful in Brazil.
Let me just add, Federico, really quick. For example, that now with all the transition to online learning, like very regulated sectors such as higher education, and I will speak for most of Spanish Latin America, but specifically about Colombia, a lot of universities that now want to get the advantage of going through online programs, not like they basically say that there's an opportunity to do a lot of online programs, but for that they have to ask for specific approvals for the degrees to the Minister of Education. And normally this process could take up until a year or 2 years for university to get approval for a specific degree. That like making the government just make those processes shorter will allow universities launch those programs much faster on the one hand, and on the other, make the students be able to enroll sooner and take advantage of the online opportunities that this pandemic is opening up.
I would like to add, if I may, just a comment on that. I don't
very
know
quickly, please, Yona, because we're
sure. It's just there's an interesting phenomenon going on in education. You know, technology stats, especially in Brazil, that we have 71 million of Brazilians accessing education through their smartphones. Is that the B2C edtech solutions are really growing because they add value to students, whether they are in K-12 or higher ed. So you can because now we have more and better products and services in a B2B scenario, the students are finding resilience and finding the best solutions for their needs by themselves, you know, not exactly through their institutions, which I think is just fantastic, you know, like people are going.
That's totally true, Jonas. Thank you for adding that. So we're having a fascinating conversation. We're reaching the end of it, and we actually want to end on a positive note, and on a note that is related to investing in the region. So if you agree, let's take turn, and everyone give us your favorite positive impact of the pandemic, a call to action, and we'll go with the order of presentation. So we'll start with Carlos.
I'm a partner today. I'm a partner in a Series B fund. 50% of our investments are being done in education, and one venture we are pursuing right now, which I believe a lot, is really finding the role of online in K-12, as we spoke before. And I think connecting people, collaboration, bringing a global perspective to the classrooms of kids, a fantastic opportunity. Think with me, kids are having classes with a teacher that is like a mile away from where he is, right? This teacher could be anywhere in the world, and he could have peers anywhere in the world, right? So that's pretty much what I believe that could stay from the pandemic and could transform the experience and education of our kids.
And that's where you put your money, yes?
I'm trying to.
Daniel, your turn.
You're muted, Danny.
Sorry. I would say just three things really quick. The first is the incredible adoption that technology and edtech products specifically are having by all the stakeholders in the education sector, like students, parents, teachers, and education administrators. It's just, we hope this to stay, and it's just going to bring up many opportunities to the sector. The second is the opportunity that comes from that, in which education is getting an intersection with other sectors, like gig economy, fintech, healthcare, enterprise, like where basically learning, education, when you see it as learning, how that intersects with other sectors, many incredible opportunities that are arising there. And then the third is just the quality of talent and sophisticated capital that is coming to the sector. We're seeing now, like, seed investment in edtech has tripled since the pandemic. And what we're seeing is that a lot of talent that before was going to fintech or e-commerce, like sexy sectors in LATAM, now are saying, like, I've always been fascinated about education, and especially like you're seeing second-time founders saying, like, now I did something before in another traditional sector, and now I want to do it in education. And then you're seeing sophisticated capital, like the leading VC funds in the world investing in education. And now Y Combinator had its largest edtech cohort now in this last cohort. And then you're seeing the leading edtech funds, which before were smaller funds, now all raising huge like new funds, because there's just tremendous opportunity. So I'm very excited about the quality of the startups that are going to come in the next year, especially seed stage from the sector.
That's exciting, Daniel. I agree. Yona?
Super quickly, I would echo everything that Daniel just mentioned, all the bullet points he covered in my mind. And I would just add that to help even further the end user, be a teacher or a student or a collaborator, an employee in a company, I think that to help navigate in the ocean of edtech solutions we are finding nowadays with so much more investment, it's a trend. We need to help sort out the best solutions and to make it the user experience easy, which in my mind comes to being like in one place, more affordable, the best solutions, so that learners can navigate and can use in an easily and smooth experience.
It makes sense, and I agree. Martin, what do you think? What are the amazing trends and things that are exciting for you?
So in addition to the one that we already mentioned, which is providing access to quality education in higher education for a lot of the population in Latin America, the other one that we haven't spoken about today is the one on corporate training or upskill and reskill. There's a very interesting intersection between the future of education and the future of work. And I've seen from my almost 15 years of experience in the corporate world that HR managers have a very tough time trying to identify which are the critical skills that the people need to be trained on, and then building pathways of education for their employees. And now what I'm seeing is a lot of very creative, innovative entrepreneurs trying to tackle that down. And basically what they're figuring out is that all the content is out there. All the programs are already built. The thing is, how do you tailor-made educational pathways that would allow each of us to reach to our next professional target? So that's going to be very interesting, and that's something that we should be looking at as well.
That's fascinating. I mean, the future of certification. That's fascinating. Jimena, you have the last word before the Q&A. Come on, tell us what are you excited about?
First, I would like to plus one on Martin. I think that thinking about skills and reskilling and everything is something super important, but I believe it can start even before. We're seeing a lot of strengths of trying to work towards hard and soft skills through K-12 as well. And I believe there's a lot of opportunity there of changing school models from the purely content-based, learn this package of knowledge and you're out of the system versus this is what you need to develop as a human before you reach the world in order to be successful. So I think that's something that I would put my money in, and it's something that is going to keep growing and that is also going to match what Martin was saying. And on the other end, I think the pandemic has exacerbated the opportunity for hybrid learning. I do think that the mix of the in-person school plus the online component in a similar way that we shop retail plus e-commerce, it's going to be really interesting to explore in the next years.
Great. Thank you for that, Jimena. That's very interesting and a hopeful message. So let's start with the Q&A. I have some questions that I have identified, but please feel free to add them. You're lucky to have this great panelist, so feel free to ask. If you don't mind, I'm going to start with one question related to Mexico, and that's one that wishes to understand what we think about the public policy in Mexico. So I'm just going to say a word about it, and feel free to compliment me, Martin, Daniel, or Jimena. The current government in Mexico is one where there is a very low quality of public policy. And there is not only that, but there are some reforms that were done by the previous government, which was not perfect at all and made a lot of mistake, but had done something that was positive for the public education sector. And we're today confronted with this government that rolled back the education reform and is developing low quality public policy in the education front. And we're left with what the private sector and entrepreneurs can do. That's basically where we're at. Frankly, some of us investors are basically waiting for this government to end in order to start to interact and engage the government to help us create public policy that is positive for the public education sector and the private education sector. I don't know if you want to compliment me, Martin, Jimena, or Daniel.
I would just like to add that for the Mexican government in particular.
No, let's go to it.
Oh,
yes.
I don't know if I'm cutting off or. Oh, yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add with Mexico, I happened to work with the opening of a K-12 school around 2018, 2019. So we were still working with all the changes of the education reform. And what we saw is even though the standard of quality is quite low, the Mexican government still has a standard of quality that you have to abide to. So it sets kind of a floor, a minimum that you have to work with, which in a way helps protect the customer in the end. It sets the minimum skill levels, the minimum content, the minimum hours you have to work with. So that helps a lot in order to structure programs and make sure that whatever gets out of the system has this minimum sort of qualifications. But on the other end, it also hinders innovation and how flexible you can be. And that also can scare investors. So it's a slopey slope over there.
Just to add there, it's interesting because in Mexico, that's in K-12, but in higher ed, there's a large percentage of universities in Mexico. There's, I think, over 2,000 universities in Mexico. A large percentage are garage universities, incredibly low quality, bad run, and kind of getting an accreditation to be a university in Mexico. Apparently, it's very, very easy. So it's that's a huge issue. On the other hand, when you have those no bars at all, and anyone can run a university, then the labor market gets very scared. And then goes to that traditional same brands as always, because they're okay, I don't know this new university, I haven't heard if it's a garage university or not. and then they continue with the same of the same, hiring from the same places, which does not improve access and equity.
That's a great example, and it's also a great segue to a question to Carlos. So Carlos, Raul would like you to explain a little bit more, a little bit further, what happened to higher ed in Brazil, and how we can avoid that in other countries.
What happened is that a fast consolidation. So first there was incentive for the private for-profit institutions to grow, to create access, because there is lack of access. Actually, still in Brazil, you have one of the largest gains in salary if you have a higher education diploma. So it adds value, right? What happens is that the consolidation was so strong. There are players in Brazil with over 1 million students, right? I think the consolidation competition became so strong that sales and acquiring students became more important than the product. Right now, what's happening years later is that some groups are facing are paying the price for not having good quality products, right? The issue here is another discussion, Federico. It's how to measure quality, right? You get a student that did not come from a privileged K-12 school, right? How do you measure delta? What about if this delta is lower? The end of the delta is huge, right? Bigger than Stanford, let's say, but the end of delta is not sufficient. So the discussion about quality is so complex that we ended up not putting all the measures in place, So this was basically.
And should the government be the one in charge of setting the quality standards? Is that a little bit like Jimena mentioned about Mexico's environment?
That's what happened in Brazil. We have a very rigorous process for quality. The problem is that how is quality measured, right? So for example, quality in Brazil is measured by number of PhDs in a school, right? You get a big score. It's great to have PhDs in school, but you need some people, right, to teach different skills as well. So it became a game at the end. You want to have good scores. It's very organized. It's all electronic. There's auditors, but at the end is the box you're checking, And my conclusion of this, and this is a long discussion, there's no one size fits all, right? Depending on your role as an institution, what you do, the type of student you work with, and you serve, there should be different ways of measuring quality. The problem is that discussion is endless in education, as you know, right? Everything in education is complex, and so that's a discussion that I haven't seen a good result yet.
And is tying back to what you mentioned, Martin, around certification and training platforms. Is that something that the public sector could try to solve, the quality signals in terms of having certifications that signals to the private market what your quality level is? For instance, in education for engineers, you can be pretty objective in terms of how good you're at Java, and you could potentially create a signal or a certification around Java programming. I don't know if you have a thought around that, Martin.
Well, I mean, they could certainly do so, but they haven't. The one clear message that government sent out there was very similar to what happened in Brazil. So they created a whole organism that was gonna regulate the quality in higher education. And they basically, in 4 or 3 year time span, they closed 30% of the schools. And all of those students got to find a new school where to study. So that's one thing they did in an attempt to try to regulate quality. Now, on the certification side, I don't have much expectation on what our government can do on that front. Even though on the engineering side and technical side, best schools best schools in the past few decades haven't been from the public side. They've been from the private sector. But thinking about what the government's role could be, I think they could send a very strong signal to the market if they start hiring students from different schools and saying that kids coming out of different programs are meeting the requirements for a job position in government. So that's a strong signal because they are the ones who are saying students are coming out not necessarily from a bachelor degree, but maybe from a boot camp or a 2-year program. Government could send a very strong signal saying I'm hiring 100 engineers or technical degree engineers that could go out there and help me out building a new factory or whatever. So I think that's a role they could play out. But I see the private sector moving faster in that regard.
Yeah, and that brings me to large companies that have need of educated engineers and professionals that are launching their own programs, right? So Mercado Libre financed a huge program for engineers. What do you think about that? Maybe Jimena, Daniel, or Yona, about companies getting into the education sector because basically there's a need that has not been met. Yona.
Sure. I was thinking about how can we be talking about education, investment, LATAM transformation, what we need to do, the jump we want to see in the transformation without bringing AI trends and the technology that AI can bring to us in education. And as we know, education is one of the last markets, vertical markets to adopt change and to embed technology in our daily basis for many reasons, all valid. But with all this technology and the investments we're seeing, I think that there is already a lot that AI is bringing for us to. Somebody asked in the chat if access comes first and then quality later and all that. I think that yes and no, because if you can combine access with quality using the right technologies, interface, teacher friendly, engaging, fun, bringing the data traction and the AI technology, we can dream of having access with quality at once without having 2 steps. I mean, this is my very much optimistic side talking here. And I think that we can look outside LATAM and then bring China to the conversation and see the amazing things that they are doing in the education technology space and how they are being able to deploy this in a massive scale. I've been there with Stanford in a research week, and we visited more than 10 different locations from private and public, K through 12, vocational, the professional development and all that. And it was just mind-blowing what we can do with the right support from the government, setup and the mindset, and the right AI technology behind it to be more effective and more assertive in what we do.
That's fascinating. I think that there's, at least from what I'm seeing from my vantage point, the investments I'm seeing in EdTech are more related to training and related to higher education. Are there models that you're seeing, Daniel or Jimena, related to K-12 that will help us come back to the levels that we were at before the pandemic and solve part of the problems that we're having in Latin America? Daniel?
Yeah, I think so K-12, like we're seeing very interesting things happening in K-12 in Asia, like China and India, like all the both test prep and tutoring. But I think it's very particular because there's more like curriculars are similar, and there's culturally they invest. Families are willing to invest in this because of how they value education and the importance that these tests have on and the grades have on getting to great universities. Latin America is a bit more difficult because it's so fragmented. Every country has its own curriculums and different tests that for example, the there's no big test prep or tutoring company in the region. I think there's still an opportunity to do something interesting in that sense. Then the other thing that we're seeing is some of the more of the after school activities. Actually, there's this company which Martin is an investor. Actually, it's called Prendea, which is very interesting. They just did Y Combinator, and basically it's just a bunch of online courses, kind of after school activities for students, and basically just it kind of is providing a lot of what the students were lost in their traditional in-person after school activities, and now they're doing it at a lower cost from their house. They can study whatever they want. I think a lot of this kind of complementary education, complementary to the traditional curriculum, is going to be very interesting, and also can develop all the social emotional learning skills that a lot of the students are not learning because they're not going to class.
Right.
So I'm excited.
Right. So those are fascinating, and Prendea is obviously a great example. I saw Gonzalo today, funny enough. Yes, Jimena, please
yes,
tell us what you think, and I'm going to ask you something
really
else.
quick on that. No, just wanted to build on Danny's last point about social emotional learning. We're seeing that, like, at least in the States, there were like a lot of companies that were working on like measuring tools or like ways of including social emotional learning in a more active way in the curriculum. And now with the pandemic, we're also seeing like private schools in the region starting to think, okay, since we're not in class and we can't tell where our students are like meeting all this like social emotional learning goals, how can we properly measure? So we're seeing like these companies and like new ventures that are like basically AI tools for measuring learning beyond like hard skills are also starting like to rise up in the region.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I have a follow-up for you, Jimena. So you have a pulse that none of us have here in this panel, in that you're surrounded by students that are trying to start companies.
Yes.
Where are your colleagues starting companies? What are you seeing in terms of education? Are you really seeing more people and more quality entrepreneurs trying to build things in education? Are you seeing a lot of movement on campus?
Yes, I'm seeing a lot. And I think Danny can also comment on this. Just as a trends wise, I'm seeing a lot of people going into the nonprofit sector, which is something that I didn't think would be that popular coming out of business school. I'm seeing a lot of people trying to invest in edtech and like exploring what that means to begin with. I think there was like this very vague idea of like what edtech was, and post-pandemic is more of like, okay, I have like this particular idea that I want to develop, and you see that like everywhere, like in all our classes, like in Startup Garage, people just doing like all these student interviews and thinking like, okay, these companies are going to be like really interesting to look at in the next like 1 to 2 years.
Good, Daniel.
Yeah, I can follow up. On the, so for example, on the investing side, so I've been working with Owl Ventures, which is now the kind of one of the largest edtech VC, and Owl in the last year hired 2 GSB students, top of the class, like, you know, top investing credentials, private equity and all the credentials, and now they decided they were going to do edtech VC focused. So you're seeing great quality going to the investing side, and then on the entrepreneurship side, a couple of our classmates going through the edtech route, not only trying to start interesting startups, but going to operating roles at Series A, Series B, Series C edtech startups. And now that, for example, we're seeing that we saw Coursera that went public last week, and like they have the size and the salaries and the compensation to bring top tier talent. So I find it very interesting when I see a lot of classmates that want to go to these operating roles and that they choose an edtech company, because there's where they learn. They have the credential. They see how it works, how the growth stage works, and maybe in 2, 3, 4 years they'll say, now that I know I have my credentials in the sector, now I'm gonna go and start my own company, and not necessarily out of the GSB.
That's fascinating, and I'm not sure I share the optimism of you all in terms of edtech competing well against fintech and perhaps logistics in the region for talent or even capital. But we're in the good direction. We would need probably 10 times as much entrepreneurs. Maybe a propel of Claudia would help us. She's listening here, but we would need 10 times more entrepreneurs and 10 times more capital to start scratching the surface of the opportunity. And just to add something to that, Kathleen, I think that if anything should be reminded, we should remind something to everybody that's listening, and thank you all for coming, is that we're all super pumped about the opportunity. We just want to deploy capital and time and talent to the opportunity. So, I mean, there has never been a better time to start an EdTech company, or to invest in an EdTech company, or an education company, or to start a foundation, a non-for-profit. So this is amazing to hear, and I think we're going to stay around in the breakout group. So looking forward to that. Thank you, Kathleen.